They said she didn't belong. Then she grabbed the mic. People often talk about breaking glass ceilings. But what happens when the room itself was never built for you? That's exactly what Maya Thompson realized the moment she stepped into a space that wasn't designed to welcome her. Before we dive into her story, let us know in the comments. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you didn't belong, only to prove them all wrong? The first time Maya Thompson entered the grand ballroom of the Prescott Executive Leadership Summit, the air shifted. Conversations paused, not dramatically, but enough for her to notice. There was a murmur beneath the polished surface of networking chatter and corporate jargon, a hum of curiosity tinged with skepticism. She'd felt it before, too many times before. Maya's heels clicked crisply on the marble floor, each step echoing in her own head louder than it probably was. Her pace was steady, deliberate, controlled. Outwardly, she was the picture of composure, poised, self-possessed, and purposeful. But inside, her pulse pounded with a familiar mix of exhaustion and irritation. She had worked harder, climbed longer, and sacrificed more than nearly everyone in this room. She had earned her place here, yet she was still treated like an intruder, like she had wandered in by accident. A tall man in a tailored navy suit caught her eye. He glanced briefly at her conference badge hanging from a branded lanyard around her neck. His smile was thin, tight-lipped. It didn't reach his eyes. "The vendors are setting up on the lower level," he told her politely, his tone clipped and dismissive, before turning back toward his group. Maya's jaw tightened. She took a breath, exhaled slowly, and adjusted the lanyard so that her name was even clearer. Dr. Maya Thompson, Ph.D., Global Strategy Consultant. "I'm not a vendor," she replied, her tone calm but assertive. "Thank you for the information, though." The man blinked, his surprise obvious for a fraction of a second before he smoothed his expression back into indifference. Before he could say anything else, another voice cut across the space, sharp and confident. "Maya Thompson." Maya turned. A woman in her mid-50s approached, her dark red power suit tailored to perfection, her presence commanding without saying a word. It was Veronica Ames, the chairwoman of the summit. They'd exchanged a few emails prior to today, but had never met in person. "Yes," Maya replied, extending her hand. Veronica's handshake was firm, but there was something in her gaze, assessing, measuring. "You're early," Veronica stated, not quite making it a greeting. "I like to get a feel for the room before I speak," Maya answered evenly. Veronica gave a short nod. "Follow me." Maya could feel eyes tracking her as she followed Veronica through the crowd. Groups of executives huddled in small knots, some laughing over coffee, others murmuring about forecasts and acquisitions. Some openly stared as she passed. A few of the men didn't bother hiding their surprise at the sight of a black woman walking confidently through the space, as if the sheer fact of her presence here was an anomaly. Veronica led her to a private lounge tucked behind an ornate glass partition. Inside, two men sat in leather chairs. One, older and broad-shouldered with a shock of white hair, barely glanced up from his phone. The other, younger, with sharp features and an expensive watch, looked up and offered a tight, polite smile. "This is Dr. Thompson," Veronica announced. Finally, the older man looked up. His expression was unreadable, his pale blue eyes cool. "Ah," he said, setting his phone aside. "The DEI speaker." Maya's fingers clenched subtly around the strap of her bag. She wasn't here to deliver a talk on diversity, equity, and inclusion. She was here to speak about global strategy and leadership in shifting markets, the same topics she had delivered to world leaders, Fortune 500 boards, and international think tanks. But she knew how this went. People saw her and assumed. Veronica, sensing the tension, clarified quickly. "Dr. Thompson is our keynote speaker." Silence. The younger man's smile faltered. He hadn't expected that. "Well," the older man finally said, his tone noncommittal. "That'll be different." Different. Not insightful. Not essential. Just different. Maya kept her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. "I'm prepared," she said smoothly. "I just need to know where I'll be waiting before I go on." Veronica hesitated a beat. "There's a green room behind the main stage," she said, gesturing toward a side door. Maya inclined her head. "Thank you." She turned, spine straight, steps even. She wouldn't let them see the frustration simmering under the surface. She expected doubt. She had braced for resistance. What she hadn't expected was what would happen when she finally took the stage. The stage lights were hot. Maya could feel them on her skin like a weight. But it wasn't the heat that made her pulse race. It was the cold, appraising stares of the audience. The grand ballroom was packed. Rows upon rows of executives, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders filled the space. Their expressions ranged from curious to skeptical. But there was something else there, too. Belief. Belief that she didn't belong. Seated in the front row was Veronica Ames, legs crossed, her expression pinched and guarded. To her left was the older man, Roland Mercer, Maya recalled, the one who had dismissed her earlier. His arms were folded tightly across his chest. His posture relaxed in a way that made it clear he was waiting for her to fail. Maya adjusted the microphone clipped to her blazer and let her fingers trail along the edge of the podium. She took a slow, steady breath. Behind her, the massive LED screen displayed the title of her keynote. Scaling Beyond Borders, the global future of leadership. Not diversity, not inclusion, business, real strategy. She met the eyes of a man near the back, who was still scrolling through his phone, deliberately uninterested. She had stopped caring about men like him a long time ago. She spoke. "Good morning." A few half-hearted responses followed, but the room remained stiff. "I want to start with a question," Maya said. "How many of you believe you're at the peak of your leadership?" A few hands rose, hesitant at first, then more followed. Mostly men. "Interesting," she replied, letting the silence stretch. "And how many of you believe your company is fully prepared for the next decade of global business shifts?" This time, fewer hands. More glances exchanged. Maya allowed herself the faintest smile. "I ask these questions because leadership is often mistaken for an endpoint," she continued. "People assume that once they've reached a title or compensation level, the growing stops." She stepped away from the podium and began walking the stage. "But what if I told you that the most dangerous place for a leader is comfort?" Some executives sat up straighter. Others crossed their arms tighter. "What if I told you," Maya continued, "that the strategies that got you here won't be the ones that keep you here?" She clicked the remote in her hand, and a graph appeared behind her. "This," she pointed, "is a projection of emerging markets set to surpass North America in technological investment by 2030. Murmurs. And this," she clicked again, "is what happens when companies fail to adapt." These are names you know. Industry giants 10 years ago, irrelevant today. She let the silence sit. "This isn't about business as usual," she said. "It's about who gets left behind when leaders refuse to evolve." Now they were listening. Maya had felt the shift before they realized it was happening. Conversations quieted. The man who had been scrolling was sitting up now, focused. Still, Roland Mercer hadn't moved. His arms remained folded. His face was stone. Maya smiled inwardly. She knew men like him. "Adaptation isn't optional," she said, her voice calm but charged. "It's the difference between thriving and collapsing." She turned toward the second row, locking eyes with a man who had cleared his throat. "We like to think of leadership as a privilege," she said, "a reward. But when was the last time your leadership was tested?" Pause. "Not by a quarterly report or market fluctuation, but by something that forced you to rethink what you know." The murmurs grew again, this time thoughtful. Maya clicked to the next slide, a list of companies that had led until they didn't. Roland Mercer raised an eyebrow. "What's your point?" The interruption was a test. She met his gaze without hesitation. "My point is simple," she said. "Every leader in this room is making a choice. Right now, be reactive or proactive. Build the future or be left behind by it." She clicked again. A photo of a well-known CEO filled the screen. This man dismissed an employee's idea to shift toward digital integration. Said it wasn't necessary. 10 years later, his company filed for bankruptcy. That employee now runs a company valued at over $15 billion. She paused. Let them feel it. The greatest threat to your success is assuming the room you built will always look the same. When Maya finished, the room was silent. Not empty silence, but heavy, charged silence. The kind that comes when something shifts. Roland Mercer leaned back, his expression unreadable, but he was no longer dismissing her. She had them. Not all. Not entirely. But enough. Leadership isn't about power, Maya said, her voice steady. It's about responsibility. The most dangerous thing you can do is assume you've figured it out. She clicked to the final slide. Solution. These companies survived because they chose to change before they had to, she said. More nods. More notes scribbled. Maya let the silence settle once more before offering her final thought. Every empire believed it would last forever. Until it didn't. And then she stepped away from the podium and walked off stage. No music played. No one immediately stood. But then, slowly it started. Applause. Quiet first. Then louder. Then all at once. Maya didn't turn back. She didn't need to. She had already won.